My son looked me dead in the eye, pointed toward the front door, and yelled that I needed to apologize to his mother-in-law or get out of his house. I did not yell back, I did not raise my voice, and I did not slam my hands on the table. I just stood up, looked at the woman who was smirking at me from across the dining table, like she had just won the lottery, and calmly said 3 words that would completely destroy her perfect life. Check the deed. 2 weeks later, my son was pounding on my door in the middle of a torrential storm, begging me to save him from federal prison. But to understand how a father could leave his own flesh and blood standing out in the rain, you need to know exactly what happened at that dinner table. My name is Julian Vance, and I am 58 years old. I built a commercial real estate and construction empire in Chicago from absolutely nothing. 30 years of breathing in drywall dust, pouring concrete in the freezing wind, and negotiating brutal contracts gave me a life of wealth. But it also gave me permanently calloused, scarred hands. I was proud of those hands. They built schools, shopping centers, and a life where my son Bradley never had to worry about a single thing. He went to private schools, graduated with a finance degree, and settled into a comfortable executive job. When he married Chloe, a woman obsessed with status, I wanted to give them a solid foundation. So, I funded the $1,100,000 down payment for their sprawling $20,500,000 mansion in Lincoln Park. I paid for the roof over their heads, the imported Italian leather chairs we were sitting on, and the quartz countertops in the kitchen. But you would never know that by the way I was treated on the night of Bradley's 33rd birthday dinner. The evening started with a suffocating tension. I was quietly eating my steak at the end of the table. Across from me sat Beatrice Sinclair, Chloe's mother. Beatrice was 58, a woman who carried herself like old money royalty, but actually lived on a mountain of hidden credit card debt. She wore too much perfume, heavily applied makeup, and a condescending smile. From the start of the dinner, she had been firing passive-aggressive shots at me. I kept my mouth shut to avoid ruining my son's birthday, but Beatrice took my silence as an invitation to push harder. She looked at my hands as I cut my steak and sighed. She loudly told Chloe that it was such a shame how construction work leaves permanent dirt in a man's cuticles. She said it with a sugary sweet tone, claiming that you can always tell who comes from the lower classes by their unrefined edges. She smiled at Bradley, complimenting him on how polished he was, completely ignoring the fact that my unrefined edges had paid for his entire existence. I looked at Bradley, expecting him to defend me, but Bradley just stared down at his plate in total silence. He chose his wife's peace over his father's dignity. Then Beatrice pushed the boundary. She gestured toward my suit, which was a classic tailored piece but a few years old. She wrinkled her nose in disgust and turned to her daughter. "Chloe, darling," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You really should put a throw blanket over that chair before your father-in-law ruins the aesthetic. That rough fabric is going to scratch the imported leather. It just feels so entirely out of place." Chloe snickered. My 30-year-old daughter-in-law covered her mouth to hide a laugh. The sound of that laugh snapped something deep inside of me. For years, I had played the role of the quiet benefactor, writing checks and keeping the peace. But looking at these 2 arrogant women mocking me in a house that my blood and sweat had purchased, I realized that my generosity had created monsters. I placed my silver fork down on the plate. The clink echoed loudly in the room. I picked up my napkin, wiped my mouth, and looked directly at Beatrice. My gaze dropped to the wrist next to her where she had proudly displayed her supposedly exclusive limited edition watch. She had bragged about being on a wait list for 2 years to get it, claiming it was a rare Patek Philippe watch worth over $200,000. Having dealt with extremely wealthy commercial clients for decades, I know exactly what authentic luxury looks like. I had also built luxury retail spaces on Michigan Avenue, and I knew high-end horology. I leaned forward. "You know, Beatrice," I said, my voice calm and level. "I may not know much about aesthetics, but I do know about mechanical alignment. The font on that watch dial is completely misaligned on the signature line. The case engraving is shallow, and the tourbillon window shows a cheap Japanese movement, not Swiss craftsmanship. If you are going to sit in my son's house and pretend to be high society, you should find a better counterfeit supplier." That cheap replica is embarrassing. The air was sucked out of the room. Chloe gasped in horror. Bradley looked up, eyes wide with panic. Beatrice's face drained of color, turning a blotchy red. Her fake facade was shattered. Beatrice aggressively swept her arm across the table, knocking her crystal wineglass over. It shattered on the floor, red wine splashing everywhere. She covered her face and burst into loud, hysterical sobs, wailing about how she had never been so insulted in her life. Chloe rushed to her mother's side. "How could you be so incredibly cruel?" she screamed. "You are a bitter, nasty old man." Bradley stood up so fast his chair scraped violently. He slammed his fist down onto the table. "Dad, apologize to my mother-in-law right now or get out of my house," Bradley roared, pointing toward the front door. I saw a weak, cowardly man who was more terrified of his wife's tantrums than of losing his father. I looked past him to Beatrice. Through her fake tears, she was smirking. She thought she had won. I did not yell. I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and stared dead into Beatrice's eyes. The smirk faded. I looked at my son one last time and delivered the 3 words that would seal their fate. "Check the deed." I walked out the front door, stepping into the cold Chicago night. I left them in stunned silence. They had no idea that a financial hurricane was heading straight for them. I got into my car and drove away. As I drove down the wet streets of Lincoln Park, my phone started buzzing in the cup holder. It was Bradley, then Chloe, then Bradley again. I didn't answer. I let the phone vibrate until it went completely dark. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse, casting long shadows across the dark hardwood floor. I had not slept much, but I felt an immense sense of clarity. For 3 years, I had allowed my son and his wife to treat me as an unlimited bank account, tolerating their disdain just to maintain the family peace. That illusion was now officially dead. I sat in my leather armchair, nursing black coffee, watching the city wake up 40 stories below me. My phone had remained silent since I turned it back on at dawn. No frantic apologies, no messages. Only a heavy absolute silence. At precisely 9 the phone buzzed. The screen displayed my son's name. I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up. I did not say a word. I simply waited. I expected him to sound embarrassed, perhaps a little ashamed of how he had screamed at his own father. Instead, his voice came through with a casual, arrogant confidence. It was the smooth corporate tone he used when negotiating mergers, completely devoid of warmth. "Dad, listen," Bradley began, letting out a patronizing sigh. "We need to talk about your behavior last night. I hope you have had a chance to calm down and reflect on what happened." I remained silent, letting him dig his own grave. "Beatrice has been under severe stress lately," Bradley continued. "Her high-end investment consultancy has been navigating a very complex merger. She is exhausted, Dad. She made a tiny, harmless joke about your suit, and you completely overreacted. You humiliated a respected businesswoman over absolutely nothing." I listened to the smooth, practiced lie. The private investigator I had hired a year ago, back when Chloe first started making suspicious cash demands, had told me a very different story about Beatrice's business. But I kept that locked away. "I am not looking for an argument, Dad," Bradley said. "Chloe is incredibly upset. She cried for hours. I am willing to forgive your outburst, but you need to apologize to Beatrice today. It is the right thing to do." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You want me to apologize to her?" "Yes, I do," Bradley replied, clearly emboldened. "And I also want to address that ridiculous comment you made, telling us to check the deed. Really, Dad? That was incredibly childish. It sounded like the rambling of an out-of-touch old man who watches too many legal dramas. You truly embarrassed yourself." He let out a condescending laugh. "I am a financial executive, Dad. I handle corporate contracts every day. I know exactly how property law works in Illinois. When you gave us the money for the down payment 3 years ago, that house became our marital property. It belongs to Chloe and me. Your name might have been on initial paperwork as a formality, but you have no legal power over our home. You cannot just threaten to take away our property because your feelings got hurt." I closed my eyes, absorbing his ignorance. My son had accepted a $800 in financial contribution from his father without ever reading the actual documents he signed. He had blindly trusted his own assumptions, driven by his ego and his wife's greed. Instead of correcting him, I decided to play the part he assigned to me. the defeated, confused old man. "I suppose you are right, Bradley," I said, letting my voice soften and inject a slight waver. "I am getting older. Sometimes I get confused about how these modern legal things work. I was just very angry last night. I felt disrespected and I lashed out. I should not have threatened you with things I do not understand." I could practically hear the arrogant smirk forming on his face. He believed he had won. "Exactly, Dad," Bradley said, his tone shifting into sickening condescension. "I am glad you can finally see reason. We all say things we do not mean when we are emotional. You just need to realize that the world has changed. You cannot control us with empty threats anymore. We are independent adults building our own sophisticated life. We appreciate what you did in the past, but this is our house now." He paused, waiting for my full submission. "So, when can Beatrice expect your apology? We are hosting a brunch tomorrow afternoon. It would be the perfect time for you to come over, bring a nice bottle of wine, and make things right." "I will think about it, Bradley," I said softly. "I just need a little bit of time to process everything. I am very tired today." "Take all the time you need, Dad," Bradley replied smoothly. "Just remember that family is the most important thing. We love you, but we will not tolerate toxic behavior in our home. Have a good day." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone and allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. Bradley was absolutely certain of his victory. He was convinced that his sprawling Lincoln Park mansion was safe, permanently locked behind the impenetrable wall of Illinois marital property laws. He believed the $800,000 down payment was a simple gift from a naive, aging father. But Bradley had forgotten one crucial detail about my 30-year career in commercial real estate. Never under any circumstances handed over a single dollar without retaining absolute ironclad control. When I agreed to fund their home exactly 3 years ago, I did not just write a check. I explicitly structured the entire purchase through a private revocable trust, the Vance Residential Trust. Legally, the house was never a gift. I owned it completely. They were merely beneficiaries with occupancy privileges. As the sole trustee, I held the absolute power to revoke those privileges whenever I saw fit. I walked over to the mahogany desk in my private study and opened my secure laptop. It was time to verify my legal boundaries. I logged into my wealth management portal, bypassing the security protocols. The main dashboard loaded, displaying my commercial holdings and the specific trust linked to the Lincoln Park property. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The title was secure. The primary mortgage was being paid down. But my instincts, sharp after decades of corporate negotiations, told me to dig deeper. I opened my encrypted email client and clicked over to the spam folder, where my strict security settings often filtered minor alerts. I typed the address of the Lincoln Park mansion into the search bar. A single email populated on the screen. It had been sent 3 days ago by a major national bank, one I did not use. It was an automated notification regarding a hard credit pull and a collateral assessment inquiry. Someone was attempting to borrow a massive sum of money against the house, and they were trying to do it behind my back. The bank notification stared back at me, its stark blue light illuminating my face in the quiet study. A secondary mortgage. For a bank to initiate a collateral assessment on a house held under my trust, someone had to submit an application using the property's legal credentials. They were trying to unlock the equity I had locked away. I reached for my phone. I needed to hear Bradley explain this. I was not going to yell. I was going to play the exact role he expected me to play, the confused, slightly anxious father who just needed reassurance. I dialed his number and listened to the steady ringing. He answered on the second ring. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that same smooth, patronizing tone from our earlier conversation. "Did you think about what we discussed? Are you ready to make that apology to Beatrice?" I ignored the question entirely. "Bradley, I was just looking through my emails on the computer," I said, making my voice sound hesitant and slightly bewildered. "I found this strange message buried in my junk folder. It is from a bank. It says something about a credit inquiry and a collateral assessment on your house. It looks like an application for a secondary mortgage. Do you know anything about this?" "I am just a little worried about identity theft. You know how these online scammers operate nowadays." There was a brief, microscopic pause on the other end of the line. It was a fraction of a second, But to an experienced negotiator, it was as loud as a siren. It was the sound of a man rapidly calculating his next move. When Bradley spoke again, his voice was slick, effortless, and dripping with practiced reassurance. "Oh, that. Yes, I know exactly what that is, Dad. There is absolutely nothing to worry about. You do not need to stress yourself out over a simple banking alert." "What is it then?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly mild. "Chloe has been wanting to do some updates to the house," Bradley explained smoothly. "She wanted to look into a small $50,000 kitchen renovation loan. We just wanted to explore our financing options and see what the interest rates were looking like. We initiated a preliminary inquiry, and the bank must have pinged your information by mistake because you are still listed as a secondary contact on some of the old purchase paperwork. It was just a technical glitch in their system." "A kitchen renovation loan," I said slowly. "For $50,000, exactly," Bradley replied, his confidence fully restored. "You know how Chloe is. She wants to upgrade the marble island and install some new appliances. It is a very standard routine procedure. I already called the bank this morning and sorted out the confusion. I had them remove your contact information so you will not receive any more of these annoying spam messages. Like I said before, Dad, this is our house and I am handling the finances perfectly. You really need to stop worrying and focus on relaxing." His lie was seamless. It was logical, casual, and delivered with the absolute conviction of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in the room. "Well, that is certainly a relief," I said, letting a long breath out into the receiver. "I was just concerned that someone was trying to steal our information. As long as you have it completely under control, I will let it go." "I have it completely under control, Dad," Bradley assured me. "Now about tomorrow. We are expecting you at the brunch. Beatrice is expecting you. I suggest you go to the wine shop this afternoon and pick out something really nice. It will go a long way in smoothing things over." "I will take care of everything that needs to be taken care of, Bradley," I replied. "Enjoy your day." I ended the call and set my phone down. A $50,000 kitchen renovation budget in a premium Lincoln Park mansion was a joke. I did not spend 4 decades in commercial real estate and luxury construction just to sign checks and look the other way. I know exactly what things cost. I know the price of custom-milled cabinetry, imported quartz, and high-end commercial-grade appliances. A $50,000 budget in that specific neighborhood would barely cover the initial demolition and the architect fees, let alone a full remodel. Furthermore, the lie was chronologically absurd. I vividly remembered overseeing the installation of their current kitchen just 14 months ago. I had personally authorized the payments for the top-of-the-line quartz island and the custom dual-oven setup that Chloe had claimed was absolutely essential. You do not completely tear out a brand new, flawless luxury kitchen after barely a year. Bradley had panicked and grabbed the first plausible domestic excuse he could think of, assuming my age had somehow dulled my professional expertise. It was deeply insulting to my intelligence. I needed to see the property with my own 2 eyes. I needed to verify the physical reality against the digital lie. I walked over to the hall closet and pulled out a dark gray wool coat that Bradley had left at my penthouse several weeks prior during a brief visit. It was the perfect, undeniable excuse for an unannounced morning drop-off. I took the elevator down to the garage, got into my car, and began the drive toward their neighborhood. The morning traffic was light, allowing my mind to churn through the possibilities. If they were not renovating the kitchen, why would they need a secondary mortgage? Why would someone initiate a massive collateral assessment on a house that was legally insulated by my trust? I turned onto their quiet, tree-lined street. I slowed my car to a crawl as I approached the massive stone and brick property. If a legitimate renovation was underway, there would be undeniable signs. I expected to see a contractor's van parked out front. I expected a roll-off dumpster sitting on the edge of the driveway, or at the very least, protective plastic covering the front door. There was absolutely nothing. The pristine driveway was empty. The meticulously manicured landscaping was entirely undisturbed, without a single blade of grass out of place. The house sat there in absolute, serene silence, projecting an image of undisturbed perfection. There was no construction. There was no remodeling project. There was only a gaping lie floating in the crisp morning air. I pulled my car to the curb and parked 3 houses down, keeping the engine idling quietly. I decided to wait and observe before making my presence known. I did not have to wait very long. Less than 10 minutes after I parked my car, the distinct roar of a high-performance engine shattered the morning quiet of the tree-lined street. A sleek midnight blue sports car turned the corner and glided smoothly into the driveway of my son's house. It was a brand new, top-of-the-line Porsche, fresh off the showroom floor, with dealer tags still displayed in the tinted rear window. I watched closely as the driver's side door swung open. Beatrice Sinclair stepped out onto the pristine paving stones. She looked absolutely nothing like a woman suffering from severe, debilitating business stress. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored designer outfit, clutching an oversized iced coffee and projecting the radiant, arrogant energy of a woman who had just conquered the world. She pressed a button on her key fob, and the luxury car chirped a crisp lock confirmation. Almost immediately, the heavy oak front door of the mansion swung open. Chloe rushed out onto the porch to greet her mother. The two women embraced with exaggerated enthusiasm, squealing loudly as they admired the new vehicle. As Chloe reached out to touch the shiny hood of the sports car, the morning sunlight caught something wrapped tightly around her left wrist. Even from my vantage point a few houses away, the blinding, unmistakable sparkle of the timepiece was glaring. It was not a standard luxury watch. It was a highly exclusive, diamond-encrusted piece that I recognized immediately. That specific watch retailed for well over $120,000, and there was a wait list just to have the privilege of placing a bid. I sat perfectly frozen behind the steering wheel of my idling car, watching them laugh and admire their new toys. The cold, analytical part of my brain immediately began to calculate the mathematics of the situation. I knew Bradley's financial compensation package down to the final decimal point. My son earned a very respectable, solid $200, zero in a year at his corporate finance job. It was a fantastic salary for a young man, but in the reality of Chicago high society, it was absolutely nothing compared to the lifestyle they were currently parading. Even with the $1,500, zeros in down payment I had provided, securing the remaining mortgage, the exorbitant property taxes, the premium insurance, and the upkeep of a Lincoln Park property of that size would easily consume the vast majority of his monthly take-home pay. There was absolutely no mathematical universe where Bradley's clean corporate salary could suddenly absorb the spontaneous cash purchase of a $140,000 luxury sports car for his mother-in-law. There was no logical explanation for how he could effortlessly drop another 6 figures on a diamond-encrusted designer watch for his wife. The numbers did not just fail to add up. They collided with basic financial reality. You do not finance that level of spontaneous, aggressive luxury on a middle management salary without leaving a trail of catastrophic debt. Unless, of course, the money was coming from somewhere else. The sheer scale of the spending I was witnessing indicated a massive, hidden influx of cash. Bradley had lied about the $50,000 kitchen renovation to cover up a desperate attempt to secure a massive secondary equity loan. They were trying to drain the value of the house, and they were already spending money they assumed was theirs. I did not linger in the neighborhood. I pulled my car away from the curb and drove straight to the financial district, heading toward the high-rise office of my corporate attorney, Marshall. The facade of the confused old man evaporated the second I merged onto the highway. I felt a cold energy returning to my veins. It was the same relentless drive that allowed me to navigate the cutthroat world of commercial real estate for 3 decades. Bradley and his new family had mistaken my patience for weakness. They truly believed I was just an uneducated checkbook they could keep in the corner and mock for entertainment. They were about to learn a very hard lesson. I pulled into the underground garage of Marshall's building and took the private elevator to the 35th floor. Marshall was a shark in a tailored suit. He possessed a surgical legal mind and an absolute lack of mercy for anyone who crossed his clients. We had fought countless legal battles together over 25 years, and I trusted him implicitly. I bypassed the main reception desk and walked directly into his corner office. Marshall looked up from his desk, immediately recognizing the expression on my face. He closed his laptop. Julian, Marshall said, his voice calm but alert. You do not usually drop by unannounced on a weekday morning. What are we looking at today? I sat down opposite him and leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany desk. I need you to bypass the standard banking channels, Marshall. I need a deep forensic audit of the Vance Residential Trust right now. I received an automated alert this morning regarding a collateral assessment. Bradley claims it is a routine inquiry for a $50,000 kitchen renovation. I just drove past the property. There is no renovation. There is a new luxury sports car in the driveway and expensive new jewelry on Chloe. Something is profoundly wrong, and I need to see the raw data. Marshall did not waste time asking questions. He picked up his desk phone, dialed a direct line to a senior compliance officer at the Wealth Management Division, and demanded unrestricted back-end access to the trust documents. Within 5 minutes, he bypassed the superficial portal and was deep into the raw financial logs of the account. The silence in the office was heavy, punctuated only by the rapid clicking of Marshall's keyboard as his eyes scanned the blocks of data. I watched his face carefully. He rarely showed emotion, but I saw a distinct tightening of his jaw. Julian, Marshall finally said, leaning back in his chair, your instincts were correct. This is not a $50,000 renovation loan. It is not even close. Tell me exactly what we are looking at, I demanded, my voice turning to pure ice. They have initiated a formal application for a secondary mortgage. Marshall explained, his tone strictly professional. It is a massive equity extraction. They are attempting to pull $1,100,000 in cash out of the property. If this clears, the property will be mortgaged to the hilt, and the cash will be completely untraceable once it hits their private accounts. I stared at Marshall, the word echoing in my mind. $1,100,000. It was not just a lie. It was a total demolition of their financial future. But the amount of the loan was not the most disturbing part of the revelation. It was the mechanics of how the application had advanced this far. How is this remotely possible, Marshall? I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. You and I structured the Vance Residential Trust to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. The trust agreement explicitly requires my physical signature and dual-factor authentication for any major modifications or equity loans. Bradley cannot authorize $1 million withdrawal on his own. The bank would never clear the preliminary underwriting without my direct sign-off. Marshall turned his monitor so I could see the screen clearly. He highlighted a specific section of the digital ledger with his cursor. Someone did authorize it, Julian. The security protocols were completely bypassed. That is what I am looking at right now. I do not understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Who authorized it? Marshall pulled up a secondary document. It was a digital modification log, time-stamped exactly 90 days ago. He looked at me, his expression grave. 3 months ago, a legal amendment was filed and approved within the trust framework, Marshall said, his voice heavy. The document officially modified the administrative structure of the account. Your son did not just apply for a loan. He used his credentials as a senior wealth management advisor to navigate the backdoor loopholes of the wealth management system. He successfully filed a notarized petition to add a secondary co-trustee to the account, granting them independent power to authorize major financial maneuvers without requiring your approval. I felt the room spin slightly. A co-trustee? Who did he add? Marshall pointed at the bold digital print on the screen. He added Beatrice Sinclair. She has been a legal co-trustee on the property for 90 days. She officially authorized the $1,100,000 equity extraction yesterday afternoon. The magnitude of the betrayal washed over me. My own flesh and blood had systematically dismantled the secure walls I built to protect his future. This was the boy I had stayed up with when he had high fevers as a child. This was the boy I had driven to baseball practice in my beat-up work truck, smelling of sawdust and sweat while he talked about his dreams. I had sacrificed my own health, my own joints, and my own youth to ensure he would never have to sweat for $1. And this was how he repaid me. He did not just turn his back on me. He actively stole my identity and forged my name to hand my hard-earned assets to a grifter. He had handed the keys to my hard-earned assets directly to the very woman who had mocked me at his dinner table. Bradley had sacrificed my legacy to fund her delusions of grandeur. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together. The smug smirk on Beatrice's face during the argument was not just about asserting dominance. It was the absolute satisfaction of a thief who believed she had successfully picked the lock. She thought she was untouchable, entirely immune from any consequences. She had manipulated my weak son into giving her full control of the assets I provided. Marshall leaned closer to the monitor, scanning the digital audit trail. Bradley did not simply guess a password, he said quietly. He executed a highly sophisticated cyber intrusion. He weaponized his intimate knowledge of corporate financial architecture to digitally forge your signature across a series of binding documents. He highlighted the verification logs. He manipulated the back-end authorization protocols of the wealth management portal, creating a seamless trail of fake electronic approvals. He bypassed the biometric verification algorithms by routing the requests through a ghost server that mimicked your business IP address. He made it look exactly as if you were sitting in your penthouse, happily signing away your legal rights to Beatrice. I sat in the leather chair, feeling a freezing calmness wash over me. The shock of betrayal was rapidly burning away, replaced by pure clarity. My son had crossed a line from selfish entitlement into felony financial fraud. He had actively conspired to steal from me, risking my legacy to fund a life of unearned luxury for two greedy women. Marshall swiveled his chair to face me directly. Julian, we need to end this right now. We have a clear digital footprint of felony wire fraud and identity theft under Illinois Criminal Code 720 ILCS 517-3. I need to call the authorities immediately. We freeze the trust, lock down all associated accounts, and let the prosecutors tear Bradley and Beatrice apart. They will be facing years in federal prison for this. I looked at Marshall, processing his legal strategy. It was the standard protocol for a corporate breach, but this was not a standard corporate breach. This was my family. A swift legal strike would only address the surface of the infection. No, I said, my voice devoid of hesitation. Do not make a single phone call to the authorities, Marshall. Do not alert the bank. Do not trigger any security warnings. We are going to leave the trap perfectly intact. Marshall stared at me, his brow furrowed in concern. Julian, you are exposing yourself to catastrophic financial liability. If that secondary mortgage clears underwriting and they extract $1,100,000 in cash, you will have a massive legal nightmare trying to recover those funds. They are actively stealing from you. If we strike right now, they will immediately panic and hide whatever money they have already stolen, I explained. Bradley knows the banking system better than the local police do. If he senses a threat, he will funnel the cash through offshore accounts and bury the evidence behind shell companies. He will hire defense attorneys, and they will drag this out in court for years, claiming it was a simple family misunderstanding about trust access. I do not want a messy legal battle. I want to see how deep this rot goes. I want them to build their own gallows. I leaned back, my hands resting on my knees. Bradley and Beatrice believe they are infinitely smarter than I am. They believe they successfully marginalized an old builder. Let them believe it. Let them draw the rope. I am going to give them all the slack they need to hang themselves. Marshall stared at me for a long, quiet moment, his fingers tapping against his desk. He was a corporate attorney, a man accustomed to standard filings and swift legal strikes. The idea of letting a $1,900,000 fraud proceed went against every professional instinct he possessed. Julian, Marshall said slowly, his voice deep and cautious, you are playing a highly dangerous game. The bank's underwriting system is largely automated, but once the funds are released into an account that Beatrice has access to as a co-trustee, they can disappear in seconds. She could wire that money to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and we would spend 5 years and $200,000 in legal fees just trying to trace the first dollar. You are risking the entire equity of the Lincoln Park house. Not if we control the pipe, I replied, leaning forward. Who is the lending institution handling the secondary mortgage application? Marshall checked his monitor, scrolling down the digital compliance file. Midwest Commercial Bank. The application was routed through their private wealth division. I let out a soft breath. A small, cold smile touched my lips. Midwest Commercial Bank, excellent. Do you know someone there? Marshall asked, raising an eyebrow. I built their regional headquarters in Rosemont 12 years ago, I said. And I did $80,000 in commercial development financing through them over the last 2 decades. The executive vice president of their private wealth division is Daniel Briggs. We used to play golf together every Thursday at the country club. I helped him secure the financing for his own estate when he was starting out. I reached for my phone, dialing Daniel's direct office line. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and immediately recognizable. Julian Vance, Daniel said, sounding genuinely pleased. It has been far too long, my friend. I was just thinking about you the other day. Are you still hiding out in that penthouse of yours, or are you ready to get back on the golf course? Daniel, it is good to hear your voice, I said, keeping my tone serious. But I am calling on a matter of urgent business. It concerns a pending application at your private wealth division. An application for a secondary mortgage on the Lincoln Park property held under the Vance Residential Trust. The warmth in Daniel's voice immediately shifted into professional alertness. Let me pull it up on my system. Give me a second. I heard the quiet tap of keys over the line. After a short pause, Daniel spoke again. Yes, I see it. A $1,500. Zizos in equity extraction. The application was submitted 3 days ago. The documentation looks complete, and it is currently sitting in the final stage of underwriting. The co-trustee, Beatrice Sinclair, is listed as the primary applicant, and it contains your digital signature of approval. Is there an issue? The digital signature is a forgery, Daniel, I said, my voice flat and calm. My son Bradley, who works in wealth management, used simulated encryption keys and spoofed my business IP address to digitally forge my approval and add Beatrice as a co-trustee 90 days ago. I never authorized the amendment, and I never signed off on this loan. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Julian, this is a massive compliance breach. I will flag the file immediately and freeze the application. I will have our fraud department contact the authorities. We can have your son and Beatrice Sinclair in custody within 24 hours. No, I said, my voice firm. I do not want you to freeze the application, Daniel. I want you to approve it. A stunned silence hung over the line. Julian, you cannot be serious, Daniel said, his tone bewildered. That is $500,000 of your equity. If we approve it, we are officially releasing the funds. If they transfer the money, the bank is exposed to liability, and you are exposed to massive financial loss. I cannot authorize a fraudulent loan. You are not authorizing a fraudulent loan if the primary trustee is coordinating the transaction, I explained. I want you to approve the loan, but I want your internal fraud unit to route the $1,500,000 into a restricted, monitored escrow account. From Bradley and Beatrice's perspective, the funds will appear as fully cleared and available in their trust portal. But the second they attempt to transfer a single dollar out of that account, your system will flag the destination routing and capture the digital footprint. I looked at Marshall, who was now nodding slowly, his legal mind beginning to see the brilliance of the trap. I need to know where that money is going, Daniel, I continued. Beatrice is running some kind of financial scam. If we block the loan now, she will just walk away, and Bradley will cover his tracks. But if we let them take the money, they will wire it directly to her shell companies or her creditors. We will have irrefutable proof of wire fraud under federal law, not just a disputed trust document. The transaction will be fully documented, and we will catch them red-handed. Daniel was silent for a long time. I could hear him breathing, his analytical mind weighing the immense regulatory risks against his loyalty to a man who had helped build his career. It is highly irregular, Julian, Daniel finally said, his voice low. But under Illinois trust law, as the sole settler and primary trustee of a revocable trust, you have the absolute legal authority to direct the routing of trust funds, even if a co-trustee initiated the transaction. If you sign a formal directive instructing our bank to hold the loan proceeds in a monitored escrow account for fraud detection, we can execute this. We will structure it as an internal compliance sting. Draw up the directive, Daniel, I said. I will sign it today. I will have my legal team send the documents to Marshall's office within the hour, Daniel said. The loan is scheduled to clear tomorrow morning. They will see the $1,100,000 hit the portal. Let us see what they do with it. Thank you, Daniel, I said, and ended the call. I looked at Marshall. The trap was set. Bradley and Beatrice believed they were about to secure a fortune. They had no idea they were walking into a digital steel cage. Within 45 minutes, a secure courier arrived at Marshall's office with the legal directive from Midwest Commercial Bank. The paperwork was thick, bound in professional blue folders, but the core of it was simple. It officially instructed the bank to hold the proceeds of the Vance Residential Trust's secondary mortgage in a secure escrow account under my sole authorization, while maintaining the appearance of a standard deposit in the client portal. I sat at Marshall's conference table and signed my name on the lines marked with yellow sticky tabs. My hand did not shake. The calloused skin of my palm rubbed against the textured paper, a quiet reminder of where my money came from. It came from decades of hard physical labor. It did not come from forging documents or swindling investors. Marshall witnessed the signature, stamped his notary seal onto the pages, and handed the documents back to the courier. Once the door closed, he looked at me, his eyes heavy with concern. "Julian," Marshall said quietly, leaning against the glass wall of the conference room, "you realize what happens once they try to move this money, right? The bank's security protocols will trigger an automatic compliance alert. Because it is structured as an internal fraud investigation, the bank will immediately notify the federal authorities. This is not a simple misdemeanor," Marshall continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "Because a financial institution is involved, the federal prosecutors will bring charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343 for wire fraud and 18 U.S.C. Section 1344 for bank fraud. Each of those charges carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in a federal penitentiary and up to $1,000 fine. Once Daniel Briggs hands over the security audit trail to the federal agents, there will be no plea bargaining it down to a slap on the wrist. Your son will spend years behind bars, Julian." "I know," I said, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Marshall asked. "He is your only son. You spent your whole life building an empire to leave to him. If you do this, you are sending him to prison." "Bradley is 33 years old, Marshall," I replied, my voice steady. "He is a senior finance executive. He knows exactly what the law is. He did not make a mistake. He did not get confused. He systematically planned and executed a multi-layered identity theft to steal $1,100,000 from his father. If I protect him now, I am telling him that his fraud is acceptable. I am telling him that my love is a shield against his crimes. That is not love, that is enablement. He needs to face the consequences of the life he chose." Marshall was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. I will coordinate with Daniel Briggs. The loan will officially clear underwriting at 9 a.m. tomorrow. The funds will appear in their trust portal immediately. From that moment, the trap is active. Thank you, Marshall," I said, standing up and buttoning my coat. I left the office and drove back to my penthouse. The afternoon passed in a quiet blur. As I sat by the window, my thoughts drifted to my late wife, Martha. She had passed away 5 years ago, and not a single day went by without me missing her quiet wisdom. Martha was always the sensible one in our marriage. When I was working 16 hours a day on the construction sites, coming home with bleeding knuckles and aching joints, she would remind me that throwing money at Bradley was not the same as raising him. She had warned me that by shielding him from every minor struggle, I was preventing him from building a backbone. I had ignored her warnings, driven by a foolish desire to give my son the comfortable childhood I never had. Now, looking at the gray lake, I realized she had been entirely correct. My blind indulgence had created a criminal. At 4:30 p.m., my phone rang. It was Bradley. I answered, keeping my voice soft and slightly tired. "Julian Vance," I said. "Dad," Bradley's voice came through, loud and upbeat. "I just wanted to check in. The brunch is scheduled for 11:30 tomorrow morning. We are hosting it in the dining room. Beatrice's favorite caterer is setting up a French station. Did you manage to find a good bottle of wine? I am looking at my collection now, Bradley," I lied, making my voice sound slightly hesitant. "I have a bottle of a 2012 Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley. I think Beatrice would appreciate it." "Perfect," Bradley said, his tone dripping with patronizing approval. That is exactly what we need. It will show her that you are serious about making things right. She was very hurt by your comments, Dad. But she is a generous woman. If your apology is sincere, we can put this behind us and move forward as a family. I am looking forward to putting everything behind us, Bradley, I said, letting a tired sigh slip into the receiver. In the background, I could hear Chloe's voice, muffled but sharp. Ask him if he's bringing the car. Bradley ignored her, but his tone shifted slightly, becoming slicker. We will see you at 11:30, Dad. Don't be late. And remember, keep the conversation positive. We want this to be a fresh start. I will be on time, Bradley, I said. Enjoy your evening. I hung up the phone. I could practically picture the scene in their kitchen. Bradley turning to Chloe, puffing his chest out, boasting about how he had successfully put his stubborn old father in his place. They probably believed the $1,500,000 loan was already guaranteed, that they had successfully outsmarted the old builder, and that they were about to secure their high society lifestyle permanently. I walked to my private wine cellar and selected a bottle of wine. It was indeed a 2012 Napa Cabernet, a beautiful, rich vintage. It was a wine meant for celebrations. I placed it on the counter next to my keys. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air of the penthouse. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., the digital deposit of $1,500 would appear in the Vance Residential Trust portal. By 11:30 a.m., I would walk into their dining room, carrying a bottle of vintage wine. The stage was set, the actors were ready, and the final act was about to begin at precisely 9 a.m. the next morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a secure text alert from Daniel Briggs. The message was brief: loan proceeds of $1,900,000 released to trust portal. Monitored escrow routing active. Let the game begin. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the message. It was done. The bait was in the water. Bradley would have received a matching notification on his banking app. I could only imagine the wave of relief and triumph that must have washed over him. He believed he had successfully bypassed my security and locked in a massive cash extraction, all while believing I was too out of touch to notice. I dressed in my usual tailored charcoal suit. I did not choose anything flashy, just the same classic, well-worn clothes they had mocked 2 nights ago. I grabbed my keys, the bottle of 2012 Napa Cabernet, and walked down to the garage. The drive to Lincoln Park took 20 minutes. The weather was overcast, a cold wind blowing off the lake, matching the mood in my chest. As I turned onto their street, I noticed the brand new Porsche was parked prominently in the driveway, its metallic paint gleaming under the gray sky. It was a trophy, a symbol of the wealth they believed they had successfully stolen from me. I parked my car, walked up the stone steps. I looked up at the massive stone facade of the mansion. I had spent 40 years building commercial high-rises and retail spaces, and I knew quality when I saw it. I had personally inspected the brickwork, the foundation, and the roofing when Bradley bought this place. I had written the 800 Ziridan down payment check, and my sweat had paid for every single brick. And yet, just 2 nights ago, my son had stood in this very house and ordered me to leave. The sheer irony of the situation was almost comical. I reached out and rang the doorbell. Bradley opened the door almost immediately. He was dressed in a casual cashmere sweater, a wide, relaxed smile on his face. The nervous tension that had characterized our phone calls was completely gone. He looked like a man who had just won a major corporate promotion. "Dad," Bradley said, stepping aside and gesturing for me to enter. "You are right on time. Come on in. The catering team is just putting the finishing touches on the buffet." "Bradley," I said, stepping into the warm foyer. I handed him the bottle of wine. "Here is the Cabernet we discussed." "Excellent," Bradley said, inspecting the label with a nod of approval. "A 2012 vintage. Beatrice will love this. She has been talking about Napa wines all morning. Come on into the living room." As I walked through the arched hallway toward the main living area, the smell of butter, garlic, and high-end French pastries filled the air. They had spared no expense. They were celebrating, throwing a lavish party on my dime before they had even touched the money. Beatrice was sitting on the custom white sofa, holding a crystal glass of champagne. She was dressed in a silk blouse, her face perfectly made up, and her fake Patek Philippe watch prominently displayed on her left wrist. Chloe sat next to her, tapping her polished nails against the glass coffee table. When they saw me enter, the conversation stopped. The atmosphere shifted into a state of polite, triumphant hostility. They did not look at me like a father or a father-in-law. They looked at me like a defeated adversary who had come to sign a formal surrender. Beatrice offered me a thin, cold smile. "Julian," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "how lovely of you to join us. I hope you are having a pleasant morning." "It has been a productive morning, Beatrice," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "We were just discussing the renovation plans for the kitchen," Chloe said, leaning back and gesturing toward the custom island. "Now that the financing has cleared, we can bring in the designer next week. It is going to look spectacular." I glanced at Bradley. He had walked over to the wet bar to open the wine I brought, but before he picked up the corkscrew, he glanced down at his phone, a quick smile crossing his lips. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was verifying the trust portal. The digital ledger was displaying $1,500,000 in fully available funds. Bradley walked back over, holding 2 glasses of Cabernet. He handed one to me and one to Beatrice. "A toast," Bradley said, raising his glass. "To family, fresh starts, and new beginnings." Beatrice raised her glass, her eyes locking onto mine with an arrogant, knowing sparkle. "To fresh starts indeed," she said. We took a sip of the wine. It was a beautiful vintage, but to me, it tasted like ash. I looked at my son, standing there in his expensive sweater, celebrating a massive theft against his own father. He had no idea that Daniel Briggs' fraud detection team was currently watching his IP address. He had no idea that the money he was planning to wire to Beatrice's account was already flagged. "So, Julian," Beatrice said, setting her glass down on the marble table, "Bradley mentioned that you had some reflections on our conversation the other night. I must say, I was quite shocked by your outburst. It is not what I expected from someone of your background." She paused, letting the insult hang in the air. She was demanding her pound of flesh. She wanted the formal apology, the submission, to complete her victory. Chloe nodded in agreement. "We just want to make sure we are all on the same page. Dad, we cannot have that kind of negativity in our home. It is not healthy for Bradley, and it is certainly not healthy for Beatrice." I looked at Chloe, then at Beatrice, and finally at my son. Bradley was watching me, a slight frown of anxiety returning to his face. He wanted me to say the words. He wanted me to apologize so his wife would stop nagging him, so his mother-in-law would think he was a strong man, and so his perfect, fraudulent life could continue undisturbed. I took a slow sip of my wine, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley. The moment of truth had arrived. The silence in the dining room grew heavy, stretching out as Beatrice waited for my formal submission. The scent of the lavish French catered brunch, the buttered pastries and the expensive cheese, seemed to curdle in the tense air. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on her fake designer watch, a look of smug expectation written all over her face. Bradley watched me, his knuckles white as he gripped his wine glass, desperate for me to speak the words that would resolve his domestic tension. He had spent the last 24 hours believing he had successfully put me in my place. Instead of lowering my head, I set my glass down on the custom quartz countertop. I looked directly at Beatrice. "I do not think an apology is necessary, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. Beatrice's smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed into cold slits. "Pardon me, Dad," Bradley quickly interrupted, his voice rising in panic. "We agreed on this. You said you wanted to make things right. Do not start this again." "I am not starting anything, Bradley," I replied, turning my gaze to my son. "I am simply suggesting that, before we discuss apologies, we should discuss Beatrice's business. You mentioned yesterday that Sinclair Capital was navigating a highly sensitive multi-million-dollar merger. I happen to know quite a few commercial investors in Chicago, and I was curious about the details." Beatrice let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "My business affairs are strictly confidential, Julian. They are far too complex for someone who spends their day managing drywall contracts. I do not discuss my portfolios with outsiders." "Of course," I said, leaning back and crossing my legs. "But when those portfolios involve local investors who also happen to be my clients, it becomes a matter of mutual interest." "My colleague was not the only one, Beatrice. I also know that two other prominent business owners in the Lincoln Park Country Club invested a total of $500,000 with your fund. They have been waiting for their quarterly distributions for 90 days. You have been dodging their calls, sending them fake account statements with falsified audit stamps. You thought you could target wealthy, older people who would be too embarrassed to report the losses. But when you cross my clients, you cross me. My compliance contacts at the Illinois Securities Department tell me a very different story. The color rapidly drained from Beatrice's face, leaving her heavy makeup looking like a pale mask. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice losing its smooth cadence. "Dad, stop it!" Chloe shrieked, standing up from her chair. "You are being incredibly rude and intrusive. You have no right to question my mother, Bradley. Tell him to leave." Bradley looked back and forth between Beatrice and me, his eyes wide with a sudden, deep panic. He was a finance executive. He knew exactly what the Illinois Securities Department did. He knew they investigated investment fraud. Bradley looked at Beatrice, expecting her to laugh off the accusation. But as he saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in her eyes, a cold sweat broke out on his own neck. He knew my corporate contacts. He knew I did not make empty statements about state investigations. He had spent his career analyzing financial risks, and he was suddenly realizing that he was standing on a landmine of his own making. "Dad, please, let's just sit down and eat. We do not need to bring business to the dinner table." "I am just curious, Beatrice," I continued, ignoring the outbursts. "My contacts tell me that Sinclair Capital is currently facing a formal inquiry for operating an unregistered Ponzi scheme. They say you have been using new investor funds to pay off old debts, and that your mountain of credit card debt is the least of your worries. They say you are short about $2,200. Zero to cover your immediate liabilities before the state regulators freeze your assets. Is that why you bought that brand new Porsche? To maintain the appearance of wealth while the foundation is crumbling?" "This is slander," Beatrice hissed, her hands trembling so violently that her champagne glass rattled against her plate. "I will have my attorneys sue you for every dollar you own." "You are welcome to try," I said softly. Suddenly, Beatrice's phone buzzed on the table. She looked down at the screen. A text notification from her private banking portal was glowing. "Wire transfer credentials verified. Vance Residential Trust balance, $1,100,000. Ready for execution." A sudden, desperate calculation flared in her cold eyes. She did not look at me. She did not argue. She slid her hand down, holding the phone beneath the edge of the mahogany table, trying to hide her actions from my view. Her fingers flew across the touchscreen with frantic, trembling speed. She was accessing her wealth management application, navigating the secondary verification pages with the ease of a desperate addict. As a co-trustee, she believed she held the absolute, unchecked authority to move the trust funds. She entered the routing number for Sinclair Capital's corporate account at an offshore bank, typed in the amount of $1,500,000, and pressed the submit key. She watched the loading screen spin, her breath catching in her throat, until the screen flashed a green confirmation. She set her phone back on the table, her confidence instantly returning. She looked at me, a cold, vicious smirk returning to her lips. "You are an arrogant, bitter old man, Julian," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can sit there with your dirty hands and lecture me? You know absolutely nothing. My business is perfectly secure, and your opinions mean nothing to me. Bradley, I want this man out of our house right now. He is no longer welcome here." Bradley stood up, looking at me with a mix of anger and desperation. "Dad, you heard her. You ruined my birthday, and now you are attacking my family. Get out of my house. I mean it. Get out." I did not move. I did not stand up. I simply reached down, picked up my glass of Cabernet, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "You really should check the deed, Bradley," I said softly. Bradley let out a harsh, mocking laugh, the sound bouncing off the high dining room ceiling. "Are you really bringing that up again, Dad? The deed? I told you yesterday. I am a financial executive. I know exactly how Illinois property law works. The $1,800,000 you paid was a down payment, a gift. This house is registered in my name and Chloe's. You have zero legal claim to it. You are just an old man clutching onto empty threats because you cannot handle the fact that we do not need your permission to live our lives." You're just a retired concrete pourer, Dad, Bradley sneered, leaning forward over the table to look down at me. You spent your life playing with bricks and mortar, and you think that makes you an expert in corporate finance. The world has moved past you. We deal with digital assets and legal frameworks you cannot even comprehend. So stop embarrassing yourself with this check the deed nonsense. It is pathetic. Beatrice leaned over, a triumphant smile on her face, and patted Chloe's hand. She leaned in toward Bradley and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. The transaction is complete. The $1,100,000 is showing as fully cleared and transferred to Sinclair Capital. The old builder is powerless. Bradley's posture relaxed even further. He looked down at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. You heard her, Dad. The money has already been moved. We do not need your cash, and we certainly do not need your condescending attitude. Apologize to Beatrice right now, or I will personally escort you out of my house, and you will never see your grandchildren. I mean it. Apologize or get out. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I took another slow, calm sip of the Cabernet, savoring the rich flavor. I do not think you understand the situation, Bradley. You really should have read the trust agreement before you forged my signature. What are you talking about? Bradley snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. Before he could speak another word, the heavy oak front door buzzer rang, its loud chime echoing through the quiet house. It was not a polite ring. It was a firm, repeated demand. Bradley frowned, looking toward the hallway. Who is that? The caterers were supposed to be finished, setting up. He shoved his chair back, walked out of the dining room, and headed down the long hallway toward the front foyer. Chloe stood up, her face flushed with annoyance. This is ridiculous, I told the coordinator. We did not want any interruptions during the brunch. We heard the sound of the heavy brass lock turning. Then the front door swung open. Instead of a caterer's assistant, a firm, authoritative voice boomed through the hallway. Federal agents, stand aside, sir. The heavy footsteps of several men filled the foyer. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she rushed out of the dining room. I stood up, adjusting my suit jacket, and walked calmly behind her. Standing in the massive foyer was my lawyer, Marshall, standing next to a tall, imposing man in a dark suit with a gold badge clipped to his belt. Behind them were 4 heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical gear, along with 2 senior compliance officers from Midwest Commercial Bank. Bradley was standing frozen by the door, his face completely pale, his hands trembling. What is this? There must be some mistake. This is a private residence. The lead agent stepped forward, displaying a laminated credential. I am Special Agent Henderson with the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force. We are executing a federal arrest warrant. He looked past Bradley, his eyes locking onto Beatrice, who was standing at the entrance of the living room, her champagne glass slipping from her hand and shattering on the tiled floor. Bradley Vance, Agent Henderson stated, his voice flat and completely devoid of warmth. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, bank fraud under 18 U.S.C., Section 1344, and federal identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. This is crazy, Chloe screamed, rushing toward her husband. Bradley is an executive. He did not do anything. You cannot just walk into our house and arrest him. Ma'am, step back. One of the tactical agents warned, placing a firm hand on his belt. Agent Henderson turned his attention to Beatrice Sinclair. Beatrice Sinclair, you are also under arrest. We have warrants for your arrest for federal bank fraud, conspiracy, and securities fraud in connection with the operation of Sinclair Capital. We are also executing a seizure warrant for all assets associated with Sinclair Capital, including the midnight blue Porsche parked in the driveway. Beatrice stumbled backward, her hand clutching the wall for support. No, this is a mistake. My merger, the funds just cleared. I have $1,100,000 in my account. It is a legitimate transaction. One of the bank compliance officers stepped forward, holding a tablet. The transaction you initiated 5 minutes ago was a fraudulent wire transfer from the Vance Residential Trust. The funds were flagged by our internal fraud detection unit. The transfer was routed into a monitored federal escrow account. The money never hit your corporate account, Miss Sinclair. The entire transaction was captured, and the IP address used to authorize the transfer was traced directly to your phone. The tactical agents stepped forward, their movements swift and practiced. One of them grabbed Bradley's arms, pulling them behind his back. The sharp, cold click of the steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the foyer. Bradley winced, his mouth opening in shock as the metal locked around his wrists. He looked down at his hands, the very hands that had never done a day of manual labor, now bound in iron. At the same time, another agent moved toward Beatrice, forcing her to place her hands behind her silk blouse. The second click of the handcuffs snapped the last remnant of her high society illusion. Chloe turned to Bradley, her voice rising in a shrill panic. "Bradley, do something! Call your corporate lawyers. Tell them this is a mistake." But Bradley could not speak. He looked at Agent Henderson, then at the bank officers, and finally his eyes locked onto me. Bradley's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps as the reality of the handcuffs sinking into his skin finally penetrated his panic. He looked at the federal agents, then at the bank compliance officers, and finally at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, childish terror. The arrogant executive who had mocked my blue-collar hands just minutes ago was completely gone. In his place was a terrified boy, realizing his perfect life was collapsing. "Dad," Bradley choked out, his voice cracking. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you gave us permission. It is just a family loan for the kitchen. We can cancel it. I will return the money right now. Just tell them you signed the papers." I looked at my son, feeling a profound, heavy sadness, but also an absolute unyielding coldness. "I did not sign the papers, Bradley. And you know it. Dad, please," Bradley sobbed, trying to step toward me, but the tactical agent held him firmly in place. "I am your son. Your only son. You cannot let them do this to me. I will lose my job. I will go to prison." "You should have thought about that 90 days ago when you digitally forged my signature," I said, my voice level and quiet. "You did not just ask for a loan. You weaponized your credentials as a wealth management executive. You spoofed my business IP address. You used simulated encryption keys to bypass the biometric verification logs of my wealth portal. You illegally added Beatrice as a co-trustee to my private trust so she could drain the equity of this house. That is not a family loan, Bradley. That is a systematic, multi-layered bank heist." Chloe screamed, a shrill, hysterical sound that echoed off the high walls of the foyer. She rushed toward Marshall, grabbing the sleeve of his tailored suit. "Marshall, do something. You are the family lawyer. You have represented us for years. Tell these agents they cannot do this. Tell them to release my husband." Marshall calmly but firmly pulled his arm away, adjusting his sleeve. He looked at Chloe, then at Bradley, his expression strictly professional. "I represent Julian Vance and the Vance Residential Trust, Chloe," Marshall stated, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of legal experience. "I do not represent you, and I do not represent Sinclair Capital. The legal amendment filed 90 days ago to add Beatrice Sinclair as a co-trustee was executed through documented digital forgery. Under the Illinois Trust Code 760 ILCS 3 PUPBUT, a trust modification executed through fraud or forgery is void ab initio, void from the very beginning. Legally, Beatrice was never a trustee, and she never held the authority to authorize a secondary mortgage or a wire transfer. Every single document she signed and every transaction she initiated was an illegal, unauthorized extraction of trust assets." Beatrice stood frozen, her eyes darting frantically around the room as the tactical agents began to guide her toward the front door. The smug, high society matriarch had evaporated. She looked like a trapped animal, her breathing shallow, her face mottled with blotchy red spots. "This is not my fault," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Bradley set it up. Bradley said the trust was easy to bypass. He said the old man would never check the logs." Bradley looked at her, his jaw dropping in shock. "Beatrice, I did this to save you. You told me Sinclair Capital was going under. You said you needed the cash to cover the merger." "I did not tell you to forge documents, Bradley," Beatrice hissed, her voice turning venomous as she turned on her own accomplice. "You did that on your own. You are the financial executive. You told me it was fully legal." The tactical agents did not wait for them to finish their argument. They gripped their arms firmly and began walking them out the front door, down the stone steps toward the waiting transport vehicles. As I watched the federal agents lead Bradley down the stone porch, I felt a deep ache in my chest. This was the boy I had built everything for. I had wanted to protect him from the harshness of the world, but in doing so, I had raised a man who believed the rules did not apply to him. He thought his corporate title and his wealth management credentials made him superior to his own father. Now he was being escorted to a federal transport van in broad daylight, his neighbors peeking through their window blinds at the spectacle. Chloe watched them go, her face pale, her hands trembling. She turned back to me, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and terror. "You are a monster, Julian. You are destroying your own family over money. We live here. This is our home. You cannot just throw us out. The law protects our marital property." "No, Chloe," I said, looking at her with absolute calm. "The law protects my trust. You really should have checked the deed. When I provided the $1,800,000 down payment 3 years ago, I did not buy this house as a gift. The title of this property is owned 100% by the Vance Residential Trust. You and Bradley are merely beneficiaries with occupancy privileges. And as the sole trustee, I have the absolute legal authority to revoke those privileges at any time." I looked at Marshall, who was already holding a legal document in his hand. "This is a formal notice of revocation of occupancy," Marshall said, handing the paper to Chloe. "You have until 5 p.m. today to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. At 5:01 p.m., the locks will be changed and security personnel will be stationed at the property. If you attempt to enter the house after that time, you will be arrested for criminal trespass under Illinois law." Chloe looked around the grand foyer, her eyes darting from the high ceiling to the dining room where the caterers were still quietly packing up their copper-warming dishes. Just 2 hours ago, she had been discussing kitchen renovation plans with her mother, dreaming of showing off her new quartz countertops and imported appliances to her country club friends. Now, she was being given less than 8 hours to pack up her life into cardboard boxes and get out. The sheer speed of the collapse was paralyzing her. She stood there, clutching the eviction notice like it was a life preserver, but it was nothing but the heavy anchor dragging her down. Chloe stared at the document in her hand, her jaw trembling, her eyes wide with shock. The luxury lifestyle she had paraded, the country club status she had cherished, and the mansion she had mocked me in were all disappearing in a single second. The silence that settled over the mansion, after the heavy front door closed, was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of Chloe screaming and crying upstairs. In the dining room, the catering staff was moving with frantic, awkward speed, packing up their copper serving dishes and silver utensils in total silence. They kept their heads down, desperately trying to pretend they had not just witnessed the federal arrest of the man who had hired them. I walked back into the dining room. I looked down at the dark red wine stain on the oak floor, the spot where Beatrice's glass had shattered 2 nights ago. It had dried into a dark, ugly blotch, a permanent blemish on the pristine wood. It was the physical manifestation of the toxic rot that had slowly infected my family. For years, I had ignored the subtle stains, the passive-aggressive insults, and the ungrateful spending, hoping that if I just kept cleaning up after them, they would eventually learn to value family over appearances. But you cannot clean a stain that has soaked into the foundation. Some things are too far gone to salvage. The only logical choice is to rip them out entirely and start fresh. "Julian," Marshall said, walking into the room and placing his briefcase on the table. "The bank has already frozen the Vance Residential Trust accounts." Daniel Briggs called me while the agents were wrapping up. Their compliance team has officially turned over the complete digital audit trail to the federal prosecutors. The evidence is absolute. They have the IP address logs, the simulated encryption key signatures, and the biometric bypass records. Bradley cannot claim this was a technical error. It is a textbook case of wire fraud. "And Beatrice?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Her offices in the financial district are being raided by federal agents as we speak," Marshall replied. "The securities department has been building a case against Sinclair Capital for months. The $1,500,000 she tried to extract from your trust was her final, desperate gamble to pay off 2 major investors who were threatening to go to the state attorney general. The SEC and the FBI have been tracking her shell company for 6 months, Marshall explained, shuffling his papers. They have documented over 14 elderly victims in the Chicago area alone, people who trusted her with their retirement savings. She owes over thousand in unpayout returns. The 500,000 from your trust was meant to quiet the most vocal victims. But now that the wire has failed to clear, the news will hit the press. Once the media picks it up, her high society friends will turn on her with a viciousness she never anticipated. Now that the wire failed, her entire Ponzi scheme is going to collapse by tomorrow morning. The federal prosecutors will freeze all of her personal and business accounts. She is looking at 10 to 15 years in prison. I pulled out one of the imported Italian leather chairs, the very chair Beatrice had claimed my suit would scratch, and sat down. I felt a deep physical exhaustion, but my mind was completely clear. Bradley will need a defense attorney, Marshall said, looking at me carefully. As a financial executive, his corporate firm will immediately fire him. His credentials will be revoked. He will not have the funds to hire a top-tier criminal defense team. Do you want me to arrange counsel for him? No, I said, my voice cold and firm. Bradley made a calculated decision to steal from me. He forged my signature and handed my assets to a fraudster. If he wants a defense lawyer, he can use a public defender. I will not spend a single dollar of my hard-earned money to shield him from the consequences of his own crimes. Marshall nodded, showing no surprise. He had known me for 25 years. He knew that while I was a generous man, my boundaries, once crossed, were absolute. "And what do you want to do with the house?" Marshall asked, gesturing to the sprawling room around us. "Sell it," I said without hesitation. "Put it on the market tomorrow. The Lincoln Park market is strong. We should be able to get $2,100,000 for it easily. Once the sale is finalized, I want the entire proceeds, along with the $1,800,000 down payment equity, to be routed directly into the new foundation, the Martha Vance Memorial Foundation?" Marshall asked, a soft smile appearing on his face. "Yes," I said. "Martha always wanted to help single parents and low-income families who were struggling to find stable housing in the city. She used to say that a home is a foundation for a good life, not a luxury status symbol to show off at a country club. My son and his wife rejected everything she stood for. They traded her values for cheap vanity and greed. I am giving her legacy back to the people who actually deserve it. I will have the real estate listing prepared by this afternoon," Marshall said, closing his briefcase. "And I will coordinate with the bank to ensure the trust assets are transferred to the foundation's corporate account once the sale is complete." I stood up, walked over to the catering coordinator, and handed him a stack of $100 bills from my pocket. "Thank you for your time," I said. "You can leave the rest of the food. Just pack your equipment and go home." The coordinator took the money, nodding gratefully, and ushered his staff out the back door. Within 10 minutes, the first floor of the mansion was completely empty. I walked out the front door, stepping into the cold Chicago afternoon. I did not look back at the stone facade. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the Lincoln Park mansion and the toxic family drama behind me. As I drove toward the highway, heading back to my quiet penthouse, my phone sat silent in the cup holder. The storm had finally broken, and the air was remarkably clean. The media storm broke over Chicago 3 days later with the force of a sudden blizzard. The front page of the Chicago Tribune was dominated by a headshot of Beatrice Sinclair, her heavily painted smile looking stark and out of place next to the bold headline, "Lincoln Park Socialite, Arrested in Multi-Million-Dollar Ponzi Scheme." I sat in my penthouse study, scrolling through the news articles on my laptop. The details were devastating. Sinclair Capital had been nothing but a house of cards. The federal regulators had frozen 8 separate bank accounts, but they found less than $12,000 in liquid assets. Beatrice had drained the rest to fund her high society lifestyle, her gambling debts at offshore casinos, and the midnight blue Porsche that had already been seized from the driveway. The booking photo printed in the paper was shocking. The perfectly styled hair she spent hundreds of dollars on was messy. Her designer makeup was smeared, and her cold eyes were filled with absolute panic. There was no designer jewelry or custom lighting to hide her age. She looked like a tired, broken 58-year-old woman who had spent decades running from her own debts. The articles detailed how she had swindled elderly widows and local business owners out of a total of $4,000,000, using their savings to finance her country club fees and luxury purchases. Over 20 elderly investors had been left completely broke, their retirement accounts entirely wiped out. The media was calling her a parasitic swindler. The country club crowd that had happily drunk her champagne and admired her designer purses was now turning on her with vicious fury. At 10 a.m., Marshall called to provide an update on the eviction. Chloe left the property at precisely 4:45 p.m. on the day of the arrest, Marshall said, his tone professional. She tried to create a scene when the security team arrived. She had hired a local moving company and was attempting to load the imported Italian leather chairs, the custom quartz countertop accessories, and the high-end kitchen appliances into their truck. She claimed they were marital property. I took a sip of my coffee. And what did the security team do? They showed her the purchase receipts and the trust logs, Marshall explained. Everything in that house was purchased directly by the Vance Residential Trust. Under the trust guidelines, they are trust assets. The security team stopped the movers immediately. They only allowed Chloe to pack her personal clothing, her shoes, and some minor personal items. She was furious, screaming at the guards, but she had no legal leverage. She had to pack her designer clothes into cheap plastic trash bags and load them into a small, dented rental van she drove herself. Did she have a place to go? I asked. None of her high society friends would answer her calls, Marshall said, a dry note in his voice. The moment Beatrice's arrest hit the internal country club channels, Chloe became social poison. Her country club membership was suspended, and her wealthy friends immediately blocked her number. She spent the night at a cheap motel. By yesterday afternoon, she signed a lease on a cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of Cicero. She is renting it for $100 a month, which is about all she can afford with her personal savings. The Cicero apartment was a far cry from the serene, tree-lined streets of Lincoln Park. It was located on the second floor of a brick building next to a noisy railway track and a diesel shipping warehouse. The windows rattled every time a cargo train roared past, and the air smelled of industrial exhaust and grease instead of expensive French lavender perfume. She was surrounded by trash bags of expensive clothes she had no place to wear and designer shoes that looked ridiculous on the linoleum floors. The listing for the Lincoln Park mansion went live yesterday morning, Marshall continued. Because of the premium location and the immaculate condition of the property, we already have two cash offers. Both are close to the asking price. One is for $2,450,000, and the other is for $2,480,000, with a 10-day closing period and no contingencies. Accept the $2,480,000 offer, Marshall, I said. Get the paperwork signed today. I want this closed as quickly as possible. Once the funds clear, initiate the transfer to the Martha Vance Memorial Foundation's account. I want the housing project in the South Side to begin construction before the winter freeze. I will have the contract sent to the buyer's council within the hour, Marshall said. And what about Bradley? He has been transferred to the federal holding facility in downtown Chicago. His public defender contacted my office this morning, asking if we would be open to discussing a civil settlement to mitigate the criminal charges. They want to know if you would sign a waiver of prosecution. Tell the public defender that the Vance Residential Trust is cooperating fully with the federal authorities, I replied, my voice turning cold. I will not sign a waiver. I will not negotiate. Bradley forged my signature to commit bank fraud. He is a financial professional who breached his fiduciary duties and broke federal law. I will let the federal justice system handle him. My decision is final. I will relay the message, Marshall said. I will keep you updated on the closing process for the house. Have a good afternoon, Julian. I ended the call and placed the phone on the mahogany desk. I walked over to the expansive windows of my study, looking out at the gray waters of Lake Michigan. The sky was dark, a cold rain beginning to fall over the city. The Lincoln Park mansion, the symbol of the luxury lifestyle Bradley and Chloe had valued far above family integrity, was officially gone. The $2,480,000 sale would fund clean, safe homes for single mothers who were struggling to raise their children in the city. The money would build something real, something that Martha would have been proud of. My son had wanted to build his life on a foundation of lies and unearned luxury. Now he was sitting in a concrete cell, realizing that when you bite the hand that built your life, you are left to feed yourself. 3 months later, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, watching the preliminary hearings for Bradley Vance and Beatrice Sinclair. The mahogany-paneled room was quiet, filled with the dry rustle of legal documents and the low murmurs of defense attorneys. It was a far cry from the opulent dining room in Lincoln Park, where this drama had begun. I kept my dark gray coat buttoned, my hands resting on my knees. I looked at my son. Bradley was sitting at the defense table, dressed in a plain, cheap suit his public defender had likely provided. He had lost weight. His hair was messy, and the confident, arrogant executive swagger he had paraded for years had completely vanished. He looked small, defeated, and deeply afraid. Across the aisle sat Beatrice. She was dressed in a standard county jail uniform, her face completely pale without her expensive makeup. Her high society friends were nowhere to be seen. The courtroom was empty of supporters, save for a few journalists sitting in the jury box, scribbling notes. The federal prosecutor spent 45 minutes outlining the state's case, displaying the digital forensics on a large projector screen. The evidence was overwhelming. They showed the back-end authentication logs from Midwest Commercial Bank, the biometric verification bypass logs, and the ghost server records that Bradley had used to digitally forge my signature. But the most devastating moment of the hearing did not come from the prosecutor. It came from Beatrice's own defense attorney. As soon as the prosecutor finished, Beatrice's lawyer stood up and addressed the judge. He argued that Beatrice Sinclair was simply an elderly woman, a victim of her son-in-law's manipulation. He claimed that Bradley, as a senior wealth management advisor, was the sole mastermind behind the trust modification. He argued that Bradley had forged the documents on his own and misled Beatrice into believing the equity extraction was a legitimate family loan. "My client has zero background in digital banking systems," the defense attorney stated, gesturing toward Beatrice, who sat with her head bowed, playing the role of the fragile victim perfectly. She blindly trusted her son-in-law's professional advice. She had no idea he had forged his own father's biometric credentials to access the funds. Bradley Vance is the one who executed the breach, and he is the one who should bear the legal responsibility. I watched Bradley's face as the words echoed through the courtroom. His jaw dropped, and he turned to look at Beatrice, his eyes wide with shock and absolute betrayal. He had risked his career, his freedom, and his family integrity to secure $1,500,000 to save her from a Ponzi scheme investigation. And now, the very second the pressure was on, she was throwing him directly to the wolves to save herself. The realization hit him with physical force. Bradley slumped back in his chair, his hands covering his face as his shoulders shook. He had spent months lying to his father, forging signatures and risking everything he had built, all to protect this woman who was now painting him as a predator in front of a federal judge. He looked at Chloe, but his wife was staring down at her lap, unable to meet his eyes. The dynamic had shifted completely. They were no longer a unified family front, but separate defendants trying to save themselves from a prison cell. It was a cold, brutal lesson in the reality of the people he had chosen to align with. The loyalty they had paraded when the cash was flowing was nothing but an illusion. During the recess, I walked out into the marble hallway. Chloe was standing near the water fountain, dressed in a simple, well-worn coat, her hair tied back. The diamond-encrusted watch and the designer handbag were gone, likely sold to pay for her Cicero rent. When she saw me, her eyes filled with a sudden, desperate hope. She took a step toward me. "Julian," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, you have to help Bradley. Beatrice is lying. She was the one who demanded the money. She pressured him. Bradley only did it because he wanted to help her. He is your son, Julian. You cannot let her destroy him." I looked at Chloe. I did not feel anger, only a profound, empty space where my family used to be. "Bradley made his choice, Chloe. He decided that your mother's vanity was worth more than his father's life work. He decided that forgery and fraud were acceptable tools to fund your lifestyle. He has to live with that choice. I looked at the scuffs on her cheap synthetic shoes, the lint on her coat, and the dark circles under her eyes. She was finally experiencing the very lifestyle she had mocked. She was finally seeing what it meant to live without a $1,800,000 safety net. But her desperation was not driven by remorse. It was driven by the loss of her comfort. She did not care that Bradley had forged my signature. She only cared that Bradley was no longer available to pay the bills. He is facing 15 years, Julian. Chloe sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ignoring the security guards watching us from the courtroom doors. Please, just talk to the prosecutor. Tell them you do not want to pursue this. You have the money from the house sale. The trust is secure. Why do you have to be so cruel? I am not being cruel, Chloe, I said, my voice quiet and calm. I am being a father who should have taught his son about boundaries and integrity a long time ago. Bradley has to learn that the world does not write a check to clear your crimes. I turned my back on her and walked back into the courtroom. Later that afternoon, Bradley's public defender approached Marshall's desk with a plea agreement proposal. Facing the insurmountable digital evidence and Beatrice's immediate betrayal, Bradley had realized he stood zero chance in a jury trial. The federal guidelines for wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft carried consecutive sentences that would have put him away for 20 years. To avoid the maximum penalty, Bradley took a plea deal. He agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and corporate forgery, and to testify fully against Beatrice Sinclair in her upcoming securities fraud trial. The deal was signed, the guilt was admitted, and the final sentencing date was set. My son had officially signed away his freedom, realizing too late that the family he had betrayed was the only real shield he ever had. The federal trial of Beatrice Sinclair began 2 months later, a media spectacle that drew local reporters and angry former investors to the courthouse every single morning. I sat in the middle row of the gallery, maintaining my silent presence. I wanted to see the final chapter of the frauds Sinclair Capital had operated. The climax of the trial came on the third day, when the federal prosecutor called Bradley Vance to the stand. The door behind the witness box opened, and 2 armed marshals escorted my son into the courtroom. Bradley was dressed in a dark blue federal prison jumpsuit, his hands and ankles bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the hardwood floor with every step. The arrogant financial executive who had once bragged about his corporate mergers and mocked my rough hands looked completely broken. His face was pale, covered in a patchy, uneven stubble that replaced his usual meticulously clean-shaven look. Dark, heavy circles shadowed his eyes, showing the sleepless nights he had spent in his cell. The crisp, expensive haircuts and the custom-tailored suits he once agonized over had been replaced by a coarse, ill-fitting jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He was a broken man, stripped of every ounce of vanity. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, unable to look at the gallery, and certainly unable to meet my gaze. He took the oath, sat in the wooden witness chair, and began his testimony. His voice was quiet, trembling slightly as the prosecutor guided him through the details of the trust fraud. Bradley testified about the exact timeline of the intrusion. He explained how Beatrice had approached him 4 months ago, hysterical and pleading, confessing that Sinclair Capital was short on cash and that state regulators were investigating her fund. He detailed how Beatrice had pressured him, playing on his loyalty to Chloe and his fear of losing their Lincoln Park home if Beatrice's debts exposed them. She told me we needed to pull cash out of the house, Bradley said, his voice barely audible in the quiet courtroom. She knew my father had structured the property through a revocable trust, and she knew I had the administrative credentials to access the wealth portal. She asked me to find a way to bypass the verification protocols. And what did you do? The prosecutor asked. I used a simulated encryption key to digitally forge my father's signature, Bradley confessed, his head bowed. I spoofed his business IP address through a ghost server to make it look like the amendment was authorized from his penthouse. I added Beatrice Sinclair as a co-trustee, giving her the authority to sign off on the $1,500 00 equity loan application. Beatrice's defense team cross-examined him aggressively, trying to paint him as the sole perpetrator who was lying to secure a lighter sentence. But Bradley's testimony was backed by the raw data from Daniel Briggs' bank compliance report. The digital footprint was absolute. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreperson read the verdict. Beatrice Sinclair was found guilty on all counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, bank fraud under 18 U.S.C. See Section 1344 and securities fraud. The sentencing hearing was held the following week before Judge Frederick Allen. The judge was a stern, gray-haired man with a reputation for severity in white-collar crime cases. He did not look at the defendants with sympathy. Beatrice Sinclair, you operated a parasitic investment scheme that targeted vulnerable, elderly retirees, Judge Allen stated, his voice booming through the courtroom. You swindled over $4,000 from people who spent their lives working to secure a peaceful retirement, and when your scheme began to crumble, you did not confess. You actively participated in a fraud to steal $1,500,000 from your son-in-law's father, weaponizing family trust for your personal greed. Your actions show a complete lack of basic human decency. He paused, adjusting his glasses. Sentence you to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. Because there is no parole in the federal system, you will serve the vast majority of this sentence behind bars. I also order the complete forfeiture of all seized assets, including the midnight blue Porsche, to be distributed as restitution to your victims. Judge Allen then turned his attention to my son. Bradley Vance, you are a trained financial professional, the judge said, his tone turning into one of deep disappointment. You held fiduciary duties, you understood the law, yet you chose to forge your own father's signature, violate a private trust, and commit felony bank fraud to fund a lifestyle of unearned luxury. While your cooperation with the government has been noted, your breach of trust is severe. A father's trust is a sacred thing, Bradley. Your father worked for 30 years in the freezing wind, pouring concrete and breathing in drywall dust to build a life of security for you. He gave you every opportunity, funded your education, and even paid the down payment on your home, and you repaid that lifelong sacrifice by forging his name, spoofing his IP address, and helping a con artist steal his savings. You did not just break federal banking laws, you committed the ultimate act of familial betrayal. The judge leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Bradley's pale face. I sentence you to 6 years in a federal correctional facility, Judge Allen declared. You will also be subject to 2 years of supervised release and a permanent revocation of your financial credentials. You will never again work in the wealth management sector. The gavel came down with a heavy final thud. The marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Bradley and Beatrice and guiding them out of the courtroom. Bradley did not look back. He walked out, his chains clinking, heading toward the federal van that would transport him to his new home, a 6-year cage. I stood up, buttoned my gray coat, and walked out of the courtroom, Marshall walking quietly beside me. The legal chapter was officially closed. The parasites had been eradicated. Cicero in the late autumn was a cold, unforgiving place. The wind blew off the industrial shipping canals, carrying the scent of diesel, wet gravel, and commercial laundry exhaust. I did not visit Chloe in her new Cicero apartment, but Marshall's private investigator kept a close eye on her status, sending me weekly reports as part of the trust's final winding-down process. I read the reports in the quiet of my penthouse, watching the city below. Chloe's transition from Lincoln Park high society to Cicero survival was a brutal descent. In her past life, her days had been structured around spa appointments, organic grocery deliveries, and country club planning committees. She had spent hours agonizing over the color of throw blankets and the brand of quartz cleaner. Now, her life was structured around the noisy rattle of cargo trains that roared past her window every 45 minutes, shaking the cheap linoleum floor of her cramped 2-bedroom apartment. Her personal savings, the cash she had managed to hide in her private account before the federal prosecutors froze Bradley's assets, were dwindling rapidly. She had spent the first month paying off her Cicero security deposit, buying basic groceries, and paying the lease on her rental van. She was down to her last $3,500. She realized she had to find a job. Chloe had a communications degree from a small private college, but she had never worked a single day in her life. She had married Bradley straight out of school and immediately settled into the comfortable role of a wealthy executive's wife. She began applying for marketing coordinator jobs, gallery manager roles, and high-end boutique sales positions in the Loop and River North. She spent 3 weeks going to interviews, dressed in her remaining designer suits, trying to project her past image of wealth and sophistication. But the corporate world did not care about her country club resume. When hiring managers asked about her professional experience, she had absolutely nothing to show. She was forced to ride the CTA train during rush hour, squeezed between construction workers and office clerks. For a woman who had spent 3 years looking down on public transit from her custom leather SUV seats, it was a humiliating ordeal. She stood in the packed car, clutching her designer bag, avoiding eye contact as the train screeched along the tracks. When she walked into the shiny corporate offices in River North, she felt the immediate chill of the hiring managers. They looked at her like a relic of a bankrupt dynasty, and the barrier was even higher than her lack of experience. Whenever a company initiated a basic background check, they Googled her name. The first results that populated the screen were the Chicago Tribune articles about Beatrice Sinclair's Ponzi scheme and Bradley Vance's federal wire fraud conviction. Chloe Vance was a toxic name. No high-end boutique or marketing firm wanted to align their brand with the daughter of a convicted swindler and the wife of a federal felon. After dozens of rejections, her desperate pride finally broke. Her cash reserves were down to double digits, and her landlord was threatening eviction if the next rent check cleared late. She took the only job that did not require a background check or professional experience. She was hired as a retail associate at a discount clothing outlet in Cicero, earning $14 an hour. The work was physically punishing. Chloe, who had once loudly complained that my tailored suit fabric was too rough for her imported leather chairs, was now forced to stand for 8 hours a day in cheap synthetic flats on a hard concrete floor. Her feet ached, her joints throbbed, and her back was permanently sore. The work was not just physically exhausting, it was emotionally crushing. Customers would throw folded shirts onto the floor right in front of her, or talk to her with a rude, dismissive tone. She had to bite her tongue, swallow her fury, and offer a polite smile. Every time a customer treated her like an invisible servant, she was reminded of how she and Beatrice had treated the catering staff and the delivery drivers in Lincoln Park. The karma was precise, sharp, and entirely unavoidable. One night, the investigator's report included a photo of her at the end of her shift. She was standing by the cash register, holding a broom, her face covered in dust and sweat, looking out at the dark parking lot. She looked exhausted, her posture slumped, her face completely devoid of vanity. When I looked at that photo, I felt a strange, quiet sense of justice. It was not malice, it was simply the closing of the circle. The very woman who had snickered at my calloused hands, who had claimed that blood-collar labor left permanent dirt under a man's cuticles, was now forced to sweat for a minimum wage just to buy her basic groceries. She was finally learning the lesson I had tried to teach Bradley. She was learning that wealth is not a natural right, and status is not a shield. She was learning that the real value of a person is built on honest labor, not fake Patek Philippe watches or counterfeit designer purses. She had spent her entire existence valuing the appearance of character over the reality of it. Now, she was forced to build that character from the ground up, one swept floor and folded shirt at a time, in the cold light of a Cicero winter. I closed the report, took a sip of my tea, and looked out at the dark water of Lake Michigan. In the south side of Chicago, the construction of the Martha Vance Memorial Foundation's first housing project was nearing completion. The steel and concrete were secure, and the first families would be moving in before the winter freeze. I was ready to see the foundation of my late wife's legacy officially open. I knew it would be a long road, but it was the only path forward. I wanted to see the first families move in, to see the children playing in a clean, safe courtyard that my hands had helped finance and design. I was ready to see that new beginning, the first housing development of the Martha Vance Memorial Foundation, named Martha's Haven, officially opened its doors in early December. The project was located in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. It was a four-story building containing 24 modern, affordable apartments, designed specifically for single mothers and low-income families who were struggling to find stable housing in the city. The local community had welcomed the project with open arms. As affordable, safe housing was desperately scarce in this part of the city. I spent the morning of the opening walking through the completed structure. The architecture was simple but beautiful. I had personally overseen the construction contracts, ensuring that the general contractors did not cut corners. The foundation was solid concrete. The windows were double-paned for insulation against the brutal Chicago winters, and the brickwork was laid with clean, precise mortar joints. I walked through the central courtyard, where 3 young maple trees had been planted in the fresh soil. I reached out and touched the rough brick of the main entrance, feeling a deep, quiet connection to my late wife. Martha would have loved this place. She had always believed that a home should be a sanctuary, a place of safety and dignity, not a tool for social climbing. I walked up the wide concrete stairs and entered Unit 102, a 2-bedroom apartment overlooking the park. The walls were painted a warm cream color, and the floors were made of durable, high-quality wood-look laminate. In the kitchen, the countertops were solid, clean quartz, not quite as flashy as the premium materials in Lincoln Park, but built to withstand years of active family life. There were no imported Italian leather chairs, but there was a sturdy dining area where a mother could sit with her children and eat a hot meal. As I stood in the quiet kitchen, I realized this simple space held far more dignity than the mansion Bradley and Chloe had occupied. We had built something real here, something that would last long after my name was forgotten. The $2,480,000 proceeds from the sale of the Lincoln Park mansion had been fully utilized to fund this project. Every dollar that Bradley and Beatrice had tried to extract through fraud was now embedded in the brick and steel of this sanctuary. To handle the day-to-day leasing and management of the building, the foundation partnered with a local nonprofit property management firm, Oak Management. They had a stellar reputation for running community housing developments in Chicago for over 15 years, ensuring that low-income properties remained safe, clean, and financially sustainable. The director of Oak was a sharp, experienced woman named Sarah Kensington. I met Sarah in the building's main lobby, which was warm and bright, featuring a simple reception desk and a waiting area for prospective tenants. "Julian," Sarah said, shaking my hand warmly. "The response has been overwhelming. We already have over 80 applications for the 24 units. The leasing team is currently conducting the income verifications. We should have the first families moving in by the end of next week." "That is excellent news, Sarah," I said, looking around the clean space. "You and your team have done a wonderful job. I want to make sure the tenants are treated with the utmost respect. Many of these mothers are coming from difficult situations. I want this place to be more than just a roof over their heads, Sarah. I want it to be a community where these families feel supported. We should set up a small library in the common room and organize weekly activities for the children. Many of these mothers are working 2 jobs just to survive. If we can provide them with a safe environment and a little bit of stability, they can build a better future." That was Martha's dream, and that is why I put every dollar of my real estate assets into this foundation. "We will take care of them, Julian," Sarah assured me. "Our primary focus today is setting up the leasing office. We have just posted a job opening for a full-time receptionist and leasing assistant to run the front desk here. We need someone to manage the application files, greet prospective tenants, and handle the phone lines." "What are the requirements?" I asked. "Basic office skills, organization, and a professional demeanor," Sarah explained. "It pays $18 an hour with health benefits. We want to hire someone who genuinely needs the opportunity and is willing to work hard to build a career in property management. It is a solid entry-level role with good benefits." "I trust your judgment, Sarah," I replied. "You handle the hiring process. I do not want to micromanage the staffing decisions. Just find someone who respects the dignity of the people we are serving. I will start the interviews tomorrow," Sarah said, nodding. I already have a stack of resumes from the local area. I will let you know once we have selected a candidate. Thank you, Sarah, I said. I left the lobby and walked out to my car. The cold wind was blowing, but as I looked back at the warm lights glowing through the windows of Martha's Haven, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The commercial skyscrapers I had built throughout my career were impressive structures, symbols of my corporate success. But this simple four-story brick building felt like the most important thing I had ever constructed. I drove back to my penthouse, my mind at ease. I had fulfilled my promise to Martha. I had turned a sordid story of greed and betrayal into a foundation of hope for families who truly needed it. I had no idea that the hiring post Sarah Kensington had listed was about to set the stage for our final, unexpected meeting. I had no idea that the digital search algorithms of the hiring websites would soon present this very opportunity to a desperate woman in Cicero, drawing her back into the orbit of the family she had betrayed. I was about to witness a final, ironic demonstration of how small the world can be. I learned the details of Chloe's hiring process later, during a routine project update with Sarah Kensington. Sarah had no idea about the connection. To her, Chloe was simply another candidate, a young woman with a communications degree who was trying to escape the grinding physical toll of a minimum-wage retail job in Cicero. Sarah Kensington started the interviews on a Tuesday morning. She had a stack of 15 resumes, but she was looking for someone who possessed both the organizational skills to manage tenant files and the empathy to handle low-income mothers. When Chloe's resume came across her desk, Sarah was intrigued. She saw a degree in communications from a reputable private college, but she also saw a complete lack of professional history until 3 months ago, when Chloe had taken a low-paying retail job folding clothes in Cicero. It was a strange trajectory for a college graduate. When Chloe walked into the leasing office at Martha's Haven for her interview, Sarah was struck by her appearance. Chloe was dressed in a simple, conservative navy blue suit, one of the few professional outfits she had managed to keep. But the flashy diamond watch, the designer handbag, and the polished high society posture were completely gone. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her nails were short and unpainted, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes looking down with a sudden deep humility. The Cicero retail job had completely broken her arrogance. Sarah began the interview by asking about the structure of her resume. "You have a solid degree, Chloe, but there is a major gap. You did not work for several years after graduation, and then you suddenly took a retail job. Can you explain that?" Chloe took a slow, deep breath, her fingers tightening slightly. She did not try to lie or construct an elaborate corporate story. The reality of her Cicero apartment and her empty refrigerator had stripped away her ability to pretend. "I made some very poor choices, Miss Kensington," Chloe said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "I married young, and I spent years living a life where I did not have to work. I took my security for granted, and I did not value honest labor. But my family went through a severe legal and financial crisis. My husband was convicted of fraud and is currently in federal prison. My mother was also arrested. I lost my home, my savings, and my friends. I had to start over from nothing in Cicero." "How did you handle the retail job?" Sarah asked, studying her face. "It was a shock at first," Chloe admitted, a slight waver in her voice. "I was used to a very comfortable lifestyle. Having to stand for 8 hours, fold clothes, and sweep floors was physically exhausting, but it was also humbling. It taught me that every dollar has to be earned, and it gave me a deep respect for the people who do that work every single day. I do not look down on manual labor anymore, Miss Kensington. I just want an opportunity to prove I can work hard and build a real career." She looked directly at Sarah. "I took the retail job because I needed to survive. I know what it feels like to lose your home and have nowhere to turn. I want to help the families who are coming to this building because I understand their fear." Sarah was deeply impressed by her honesty. In her line of work, she met many applicants who tried to hide their struggles behind corporate jargon. Chloe's raw, unvarnished confession showed a genuine depth of character. Furthermore, Chloe did not mention my name, and she did not make the connection to the foundation. When she had seen the listing for the Martha Vance Memorial Foundation, the name had not registered with her. During her marriage, she had been entirely self-absorbed, never caring about Bradley's family history or the name of his late mother, whom she had never met. To Chloe, the foundation was just a local nonprofit community housing developer. "Well, Chloe," Sarah said, closing the file, "your qualifications are excellent and your communication skills are clear, but more importantly, I value your honesty. This building serves families who have experienced severe struggles. We need a receptionist who treats them with dignity, not pity. I think you have the empathy to do this job well." "Thank you, Miss Kensington," Chloe said. "The position pays $18 an hour with full health insurance and 2 weeks of paid vacation," Sarah said. "We would like you to start next Monday at 8:30 a.m. Will that work for you?" Tears filled Chloe's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with a tissue, nodding. "Yes, Miss Kensington, it will. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I promise I will not let you down." She signed the employment contract, her hand shaking slightly as she penned her name, Chloe Vance. Sarah Kensington sent a digital copy of the signed contract to Marshall's office for the Foundation's corporate archives. On Friday afternoon, Marshall forwarded the folder to my laptop, along with the weekly financial updates. I opened the document, scrolling down to the final page containing the signature. My eyes locked onto the printed name, Chloe Vance. I sat in my leather chair, staring at the screen for a long time. The irony of the situation was absolute. The very woman who had snickered at my rough hands and demanded my expulsion from her home was now my employee. Her salary, her health benefits, and the roof over her leasing office would be funded entirely by my commercial assets. I leaned back, a small, cold smile touching my lips. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. I did not contact Sarah, and I did not tell her to cancel the contract. I had built my empire by observing people and anticipating their moves, and I wanted to see how Chloe would react on her first day of work. I wanted to see if her new humility was real, or if she would collapse back into vanity when confronted with the truth. The trap had closed, but this time it was a trap of her own making, drawing her back to the very hands she had mocked. Chloe started her job at Martha's Haven at precisely 8:30 a.m. on Monday morning. According to Sarah Kensington's daily logs, she worked with diligent, quiet efficiency. She spent the morning sorting applicant folders, answering phone lines, and greeting the first families who arrived to inspect their new apartments. She showed a genuine, soft-spoken kindness to the single mothers, carrying their strollers up the front steps and offering them hot coffee as they waited for their paperwork. The arrogance of the woman who had snickered at my suit in Lincoln Park was entirely gone, replaced by the quiet diligence of someone who understood what it meant to struggle. At 2 p.m., Marshall and I arrived at the property for the monthly Board of Trustees site inspection. I wore my usual tailored charcoal suit. I did not enter through the back office. I walked directly through the main glass doors of the lobby, Sarah Kensington walking beside me. Chloe was sitting at the reception desk, typing on her computer. Hearing the doors slide open, she stood up, a professional smile on her face, and looked up to greet the visitors. The smile instantly froze on her lips. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely pale and stunned. Her hand flew to her collarbone, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at me. Her eyes darted from my face to Marshall's and then to the large bronze plaque mounted on the lobby wall behind her. The Martha Vance Memorial Foundation. Built in honor of Martha Vance, 1968-2021. In that single second, the pieces of the puzzle snapped together in her mind. She realized that the foundation paying her $18 hourly salary, the building providing her security, and the very desk she sat behind were funded by the man she had mocked. She realized that the Martha Vance the foundation was named after was Bradley's late mother. "Hello, Chloe," I said, my voice calm and perfectly professional. "I see you are getting the leasing files organized." Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was dry, and she could only manage a slight trembling nod. Sarah Kensington looked back and forth between us, her brow furrowed in surprise. "Oh, do you two know each other?" "Yes," I said, keeping my tone mild. "Chloe is my former daughter-in-law." Sarah's eyes went wide, but she kept her composure. "I see. I had no idea." "It is quite all right," I said. "Chloe, would you mind joining me in the private conference room next to the lobby for a moment? I would like to have a brief word with you." Chloe nodded. her hands shaking as she stepped out from behind the desk. She followed me into the small conference room, closing the door behind her. She stood near the table, her head bowed, her shoulders tense, looking like a defendant waiting for a verdict. "Julian," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking as tears filled her eyes. I am so sorry. I did not know this was your foundation. I swear I did not apply here to cause trouble. I only saw the listing online under Oak Ridge Management. If you want me to leave, I will pack my things right now, I understand." I walked over to the window, looking out at the courtyard where the small maple trees stood under the winter sky. I turned back to face her. My eyes dropped to her hands. They were no longer perfectly manicured. The skin was dry, slightly chapped from her Cicero retail work, and her nails were short and clean. "I am not going to fire you, Chloe," I said, my voice steady. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with shock. You aren't?" "Sarah says you performed exceptionally well in the interview," I explained. "She believes you have the empathy and organization to run this office, and I do not interfere with her staffing decisions. Your contract is with Oak Ridge Management, and as long as you work hard and treat our tenants with respect, your job is secure." I walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. I raised my hands, turning my palms up so she could see the permanently calloused, scarred skin. "But I want you to remember this moment, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice quiet but firm. "The money that pays your salary, that provides your health benefits, and that keeps a roof over your head. It comes from these very hands. These unrefined edges built the foundation of your survival today. Remember that when you sweep this floor or manage these files. Work hard, be honest, and take care of the families who come here looking for a fresh start." Chloe let out a quiet sob, her head bowing as she wept. Her tears were not the theatrical wails her mother had produced at the dinner table. They were the quiet tears of genuine shame and deep gratitude. "I will, Julian," she sobbed, nodding repeatedly. "I promise you I will. I am so sorry for how I treated you. I was so foolish." "The past is behind us, Chloe," I said softly. "Focus on the work ahead." I turned, walked out of the conference room, and closed the door behind me, leaving her to compose herself. I rejoined Sarah and Marshall in the lobby, and we proceeded with the building inspection. As I walked through the corridors, I felt a deep, quiet peace. The circle was complete. The hands they had mocked had not just survived their betrayal. They had built a sanctuary for the helpless, and they had ultimately provided a lifeline for the very woman who had spat on them. My legacy was finally secure, and the foundation of my life work was built on solid ground. I knew that Martha was looking down from somewhere, smiling her warm, gentle smile. We had not just built brick and steel. We had built a path for redemption, and that was the greatest monument of all today. The cold wind of Chicago and the heavy weight of the past have been permanently replaced by the warm golden light of the Florida sun. It is setting beautifully over the calm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I am sitting alone on the spacious aft deck of my private yacht, listening to the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the ocean waves against the hull. The air is thick with the scent of salt and absolute freedom. I watch the seabirds soar against the fading light, feeling a profound, deep tranquility in my chest. It is a profound, unshakable peace that I have not truly felt in years. For decades, my entire existence was defined by the relentless grind of building an empire, pouring concrete in the freezing wind, and fighting corporate competitors. And then, it was defined by the exhausting, toxic weight of Bradley and Chloe's insatiable greed. Now there is only the vast open horizon stretching out before me. The heavy burden of blind paternal obligation has been completely lifted from my tired shoulders. Resting quietly on the polished teak table beside my lounge chair is my digital tablet. A final email from Marshall is glowing on the screen. I pick up the device, tapping the glass to open the legal summary of the absolute resolution. The federal justice system often moves slowly, but when the evidence is absolute, the hammer of the law is unforgiving. Beatrice Sinclair's Ponzi scheme collapsed completely within days of her arrest. The federal forensic accountants easily traced the web of her fraud, exposing how she had swindled elderly victims to fund her luxury sports cars and casino debts. The judge showed her absolutely no mercy during the sentencing phase. Beatrice is currently serving her 12-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Because there is no parole, she will spend her elderly years inside a tiny concrete cell, stripped of the false glamour she valued far above basic integrity. Bradley did not possess the moral courage to face a lengthy public trial. Once he realized I was completely unwilling to post his bail or fund his defense, his executive swagger evaporated. He accepted a plea deal. My former son received 6 hard years in a federal correctional facility for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and corporate forgery. He has sent me numerous letters from his holding cell, begging for my forgiveness, pleading for just one final financial bailout. He writes about the cold concrete floors, the tasteless food, and the heavy security doors that lock him in every single night. He begs me to use my banking connections to secure him an early release. I have returned every single letter entirely unopened. He made his choice the very second he forged my name and betrayed my trust. And now, he must live with the reality of his 6-year cage. The final section of Marshall's report outlines the status of Chloe. She has officially filed for divorce, legally separating herself from Bradley and his federal conviction. But she did not try to return to her high society lifestyle. She remained at her job at Martha's Haven, working the reception desk with quiet dedication. Sarah Kensington's reports indicate that Chloe has been promoted to a junior property manager, now earning $22 an hour. She still lives in her small apartment in Cicero, taking the train to work every morning. The manicured vanity is gone, replaced by the genuine pride of a woman earning an honest living. She has spent the last 6 months learning the value of hard work, and she has finally earned my respect. I placed the tablet face down on the teak table. The legal nightmare is officially closed. The toxic parasites that tried to bleed my empire dry have been completely eradicated from my life. I reach into my linen jacket and withdraw a thick document. It is the final transfer authorization Marshall prepared. I pick up a gold fountain pen. With a few swift, decisive strokes, I legally transfer the vast majority of my remaining commercial assets directly into the Martha Vance Memorial Foundation. The foundation will now build 3 more housing projects in the South Side, fully funding the dreams of underprivileged children who possess the drive and moral character my son lacked. I cap the pen and set it down. It is finally done. The fortune I built from raw dirt and honest sweat will never again fund luxury sports cars or fake Patek Philippe watches. It will build bright futures for families who truly deserve it. I reach over to the ice bucket and pour myself a glass of Cabernet. The setting sun paints the sky in streaks of orange and violet. I raise the glass toward the endless horizon, breathing in the clean salt air. I did not just survive a calculated betrayal. I completely, ruthlessly eradicated a terminal cancer from my life. I take a slow, satisfying sip of the wine. My mind is clear, my conscience is clean, and my legacy is secure. Blood does not entitle anyone to a lifetime of blind loyalty, especially when it is repaid with arrogance and deceit. As parents, we often sacrifice everything to give our children the world, ignoring the entitlement it breeds. But true love sometimes requires stepping back and letting them face the devastating consequences of their own greed. A father's duty is to provide a foundation, not a shield from the law. When a child chooses to betray the hands that built their life, the greatest act of self-respect a parent can take is to let them fall entirely alone. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own sanity and future? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss our next story. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong, value what is real, and never let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness.